Good morning, and thank you for joining the Age of Precision Category Management, using hyper-localized assortment optimization to meet shopper demand with Hivery. As a reminder, if you have any questions during the conversation, to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now here's your host, Deborah Weinswig, CEO and founder of Coresight Research.
Thank you so much, Drew. Very excited to be here today with Hivery. And we're going to talk about a really critical subject, which is certainly came to light during the past 14 months, which is around how important effective assortment and space localization can be, and the very challenging task for CPG companies and really retailers, as we've seen. If it's done right, the incremental value generated is really quite significant. And I think we've seen this over time, but once again, this has really kind of been called out most recently. And one thing we're going to talk about today is this idea of a cluster approach, which I've also found to be, incredibly value add, and how we think about, the future of physical retail and also digital. And so whether retailers and, CPGs are using this approach or not, the ability for retailers and CPG companies to leverage store level data in new ways really opens up a lot of new opportunities to have the right product at the right time to meet the right customer across the store, which has really been, kind of true retail nirvana for some time. I'm truly honored to be here today with Steve Weir and Zach Simpson to discuss the significant incremental data that, optimizing the assortment at the store level through advanced technologies such as machine learning and data science can bring to retailers and to brands. And so for those of you who don't know Steve, Steve joined Hivery as the VP of Client Services after spending over 20 years in category management and shopper research. And he holds he's held very diverse roles at world-leading CPG companies such as Coca-Cola, Conagra, and Kraft. And we also are excited to be joined by Zach Simpson, who's leading Hivery's analytical consultation organization. And before he had joined Hivery, he spent over 15 years in retail merchandising roles, including Walmart. And he and I've had some very interesting conversations from my Wall Street days. And this really culminated in his role as VP of merchandising for the non-alcoholic beverages department. Zach leads, a lot of the thought leadership that we're going to talk about today, and we're very excited to have everybody join. We will be launching a poll. Please participate. And then also, once again, let's keep this casual. Please ask questions as they arise, and we will weave them into the conversation and ask them during the conversation we're having. So, today we want to cover pathways to incremental category growth, the future of retail category management with next-gen clustering. I do think that this kind of clustering topic, which is fairly, has been fairly critical for retail, but we're starting to see, kind of more and more around this conversation. And then really, the top advantages in retail supplier collaboration, that has, I think, really been brought to the front lines, if you will. And then, we'll go through kind of our key insights and recommendations. And so, kind of getting started here, as we think about, how technology plays a paramount role in achieving incremental category growth, we've been talking about, as we mentioned in the opening, this incremental category growth requiring, the ability of, right product, right store, right time. And, with what we've seen around, whether it's, poor in-store execution costing sales, whether it's, thinking about, the effectiveness of different, kind of supplier and retailer collaborations and how this is fueling decision-making. What we've seen over time, and once again, going back to my days as an analyst, that, the impact of poor execution at the store level really does have a significant impact on sales. And so whether it's an item is out of stock, and maybe it's in the store, but it's on a different shelf, or it's still in the back of the store, or, kind of different analytics around how customers are behaving, if it's going to rain, right? How do we reposition merchandise? So this is, we're talking almost $100 billion impact. That's very sizable. And so I think that, Zach, how are, if you can just take an approach on this, how are you seeing retailers use technology now to draw shopper insights in your experience? And how can, ML help, CPG companies and retailers adapt to this really fast changing environment? And, what have you learned and what have we learned in the past 14 months to help us going ahead?
Yeah, I think that this, really rapidly emerging space, one of the key things that I'm seeing is we're just able to pull so many disparate like data sources together that traditionally maybe we haven't, right? And so what ML is really, really good at is finding patterns in the data that maybe you can't see when it's in aggregate capacity in some way, shape, form, or fashion like that. But bringing together those like dispersed data sources, whether it be store labor or profitability or markdown components, the velocities of individual store item combinations and how they all relate to one another, is, I think, really coming together in a way that's really, really exciting for the retail space, because it's going to give us the ability to manage that whole ecosystem in a way in which we've never been able to do before, because the human mind just doesn't have the capacity to sort of process all that. But the number one thing that it does for you is it allows you let computers do what computers do well, and humans do what humans do really, really well, and that gives us sort of the speed of decision making and the ability to rapidly run these analytics, finding patterns, identifying those patterns, right? And then it really gives us then the ability to manage complexity to the manner with which we want to. So we can connect the dots across the retail ecosystem, do it really, really, really fast, to your point about sort of, the speed and pace of change. And then the ability to go in and say, well, what can we tangibly execute in this space? Because insights are all good, grand, wonderful. But at the end of the day, if you can't go action those insights, or they're too darn complex for you to go actually execute, I think what you're seeing is these types of technologies which are emerging allow you to manage a ton of data, bring together a lot of sources of data, and then re-aggregate them in a capacity that is executable, in a way that is really, really fast. And so that sort of combination of factors, I think, is really is really what the catalyst for disruption is here.
I mean, it sounds incredibly complex. I mean, Steve, what are some of the advantages of looking at store level data when looking to expand, category share? And, we often, I think we've all gotten so caught up in kind of e-commerce growth that in some ways, store level has been, left as maybe an afterthought.
Yeah. So there's only one way that I know of to grow share, and that is to sell more stuff at a faster rate than your competition. And store specific is really, sometimes I could call it the last mile of category management. There are advantages to it. Obviously, when you're store specific, you become more relevant within that store to a very specific shopper base. And when you're more relevant, you sell more stuff. Also store specific, you're in essence curating how that shelf looks and its capacity to meet minimum days of supply. Therefore, you run out of stock less often. And when you do that, you sell more stuff. And then finally, I would say that there's an element of store specific allows for guaranteed execution, right? So you're not getting a clustered idea that you hope works in your store. You're getting a store specific idea that is aware of space and aware of the shoppers, and therefore is making a very curated recommendation that is going to fit, right? I've been in retail for a long time. I used to work in stores, and there was nothing more frustrating than getting a generalized average idea and then trying to make that fit. And we're trying to get out of that because there's more juice to be squeezed the lower you go.
Well, also too, right? I mean, if we think about, right, from a store manager level, just even job satisfaction, right? Having the opportunity to be able to have more control over their own destiny, right? That really is the holy grail, right?
Yeah, very well said. Absolutely. So.
And so I think, we've already got the poll back. I mean, I think it is really interesting in terms of looking at, some of the challenges, everyone is facing and to kind of what extent they're using, advanced analytical methods. We've only got 8% of, those who responded who said that they are using kind of advanced analytical tech, solutions such as ML or data science to really help them engage in store. it's, and kind of very effective or moderately effective is, 23%, let's say it's a quarter. It's much lower than I would have expected. Obviously, Steve and Zach, you guys are, in the trenches every day. Would you have thought that number would be at that level? And what does that tell us?
Yeah, I absolutely does not surprise me that number is so low. And it's so low it's one guy's opinion, right? But I think it's low because it's intimidating and it's hard. And so it's on these companies. I mean, obviously, I work with Hivery, and I think what we've done is we've tried to make this really accessible for frontline users, right? If the people who understand the problems the best, the folks on the front line, the category managers, the merchants at organizations, or the partnership between the two of them, if those folks who know the problem sets better than anybody else can now have access to this really, really powerful computing capacity, or the machine learning components, right? That's where I believe the magic happens. And that's what we've tried to do. And I'm sure there's, other companies that are trying to make this really, really accessible for people, but it's really intimidating. And you get into this notion, Deborah, of like, well, it can't be a black box, right? We have to be able to explain what, like, I have to have command of my business. I have to be able to say why things are going on. And so the ability to come back and actually look through the tool, whether that's, ours with Curate, or which is our tool at Hivery that we're using, or others in the industry, like the ability to understand what's going on, and then the ability to actually utilize this type of technology, I think is intimidating. And in a lot of instances, there's sort of, you have to have a PhD in mathematics or computer science masters in order to be able to navigate some of these kind of components. And we're democratizing this space for the people that understand the retail problem set rather than the technological problem set.
I think that's very well said. I mean, if we look at, kind of our, the next section, this is, to me, the holy grail of this slide, this idea, the clustering. And I look at it from a store's perspective, from a consumer perspective, because what you think, right, should be clustered isn't necessarily what should be. And so this idea, right, I love it, like next generation clustering. And I think that, we had talked about this idea around kind of a Netflix type approach, right, where, if, one of us is watching horror movies and one of us is watching, kind of, sappy movies, kind of this idea that we're being served up. If we're the horror movie, kind of lover, we're continuing to get those as opposed to getting sappy movies. And so I think that, this idea around kind of just smarter stores, smarter clusters, and what we can learn from that too at kind of a organization level. And then once the, kind of clusters are able to have a greater impact on each other. I mean, Zach, this is always about dollars and cents. So what's the financial benefit to retailers of this kind of store level analysis to clustering? And how do you think about it from a Netflix approach?
Yeah, so I'll give you sort of the aggregated benefits first, right? And Steve does a fantastic job of talking about the Netflix approach to all this. But everybody on here is going to expect me to say sales and profit, right? And that is absolutely 100% true. We see anywhere between about 275 to 700 basis points of acceleration by going away from traditional clustering top down to a bottoms up type of approach. The other great thing about working in this type of technology, Deborah, is you literally go in and set an objective function for, do I want to pursue profitability? Do I want to pursue unit productivity? Do I want to pursue comp in this space, right? In this optimization for this category, in these stores, what am I really trying to do? So it gives you the ability that if I have I'm a merchant or I'm a category advisor, and my role in that portfolio for that retailer is to drive profitability, I can set very aggressive profit weighting for my objective function in my optimization and go pursue that. But while I think looking at revenue acceleration and comp, profitability acceleration through that type of a pursuit and mix change certainly has financial benefits, we see a lot of other benefits to this that are I think really notable and also really novel, Deborah. So the first thing that we see is the ability to inject things like store level labor into this, right? I mean, you look at like Walmart's a 23% gross. I'm just gonna use Walmart as an example because I know it. They net about 3.5%, right? The difference between gross and net, a huge percentage of that is store labor. So it's not just missing sales and out of stocks, right? It's also how does that organization manage the labor within the box that they've got? And so what we can do now with store level planograms or cluster level planograms is really begin to optimize your operational labor. We also now can optimize, and there's a financial benefit to the, let's call it white collar labor, the headquarter labor that exists out there of, there's really like two types of companies that we work with. Like one is already doing store level planograms, right? And they're like, oh my gosh, we're throwing an army of people at this problem. And so we help them speed up that like drawing and assortment selection process, which is, you know, we see about an 80% benefit to time drawing and, or the time of drawing and improvement in efficiency. And that allows you to do things with that group, like either expand the scope of your influence with other retailers or other categories. It allows you to spend more time working on strategic collaboration and in those spaces. So yes, we see financial acceleration in the form of like revenue and profitability through just the ability to get down to a more granular level. But we also see sort of next gen financial acceleration, which is your strategic partnership with your customer, your actual efficiency within the context of the work you're doing, and then your retailers' labor productivity, which we can now begin to go even monetize, which is really, really, really cool.
And then, you know, Steve, is maybe you can kind of double click into this whole kind of Netflix approach, but, you know, how does, you know, Hivery's approach to clustering kind of incorporate, you know, my background as a strategist, right? The economic concepts such as transferable demand into the model. And can you give a few examples?
Yeah, so without transferable demand, we start to lose precision. And there's a ripple effect with every decision that someone makes relative to assortment and space. And that ripple effect has been historically very difficult to understand, but it needs to be taken into consideration. That ripple effect also differs from one store to the next. So Hivery's approach is unique in that we approach our, you know, air quote segmentation based off of purchase patterns instead of shopper profiles, right? We're actually more concerned about what a shopper purchases instead of who a shopper is. And so in a way, as you mentioned, our approach to transferability of demand and clustering is similar to the way that Netflix does it, right? Netflix, thank goodness, doesn't care who I am. It only cares what I like, because if it cared who I am, it would lump me and Zach into the exact same bucket. And therefore we would be served content in the exact same way. Yet, you know, Zach likes to watch romance comedies, and I like to watch things that blow up, right? We're very, very different when it comes to what we like to consume, yet we would be treated exactly the same if we continued to apply the same type of top-down approach. And so we want to our view is that the best predictor of purchase behavior is purchase behavior. And so we studied that. We map where purchase behavior is very similar across stores within that particular category. And we're able to, in essence, say, you should probably do store specific up to, 30% of your stores, and then go clustering with the rest. And here's the ideal number of clusters. Again, based on not the outlet profile, not the shopper profile, but what is being purchased, because ultimately that's what retail cares about, is what's being purchased more than they care about, and it should be, who is purchasing it. So that's how we're different. So.
And then can you help me understand, right, how do we take into, account, right, when we're picking from the stores as well for e-commerce, and then also we have, it's called the professional shopper, and then we have, kind of your everyday shopper who's in the store. How does that kind of change the balance, and what are the challenges that that presents?
Yeah. So fortunately, when it comes to brick and mortar and then things like at store pickup, most of those sales are reflected within the total brick and mortar store. And therefore, the AI is picking that up. If there are additional data sets, going back to one of the original questions that you asked and that Zach addressed, is that we can append to other data sets to help us visualize and see which items are being purchased through which mode, right? Am I purchasing it online and then just picking it up? Am I purchasing it online and then it gets shipped to me? Obviously, when it comes to curating an assortment and the amount of space, that's very, very different digitally than it is physically. And therefore, you should treat them differently. Digitally, it's endless, right? There is no shelf. Therefore, you can curate an impossibly long tail of items. In a store, you have to actually fit it in to designated space. And so the ability to take those insights and apply them to a predictive model, moving out of the traditional descriptive analytics that Catman is famously known for, that we've been doing for 20 some odd years, into predictive, which the industry is going through pretty well now, into prescriptive, which is, okay, now what do we do with our predictive models? That's how we handle things like e-com in-store or pickup in-store, and then just pure brick and mortar play. We dial down or dial up the constraints that the ML needs to take into consideration based off of those influential insights coming from those traditionally separate data sources.
This is actually a really interesting question from the audience. Thank you, Addie. Do you include in your analysis any externalities? For example, for an outdoor goods store, what is nearby? Example, lake streams versus ocean. And do you also include seasonality?
So really good question. Steve, jump in as well. So the answer is yes and no. Yes, we can include any data set you guys would want to include in it. Obviously, we need to take a look at it and understand how clean is it, all of those types of components, right? But yes, we can include it in the analysis, but this is where I say the no. It is astonishing to me, as someone who had access to a ton of data in my past life, how little data is required to actually go run these types of optimizations, right? And to understand it. So as an example, it really at a bare minimum, latitude, longitude, UPC, movement, like that's it. That's really all you need for the computer to go through and begin to analyze these extraordinary patterns that exist. And the really cool thing about it is we bring natural biases as humans to what we should find patterns in and what we shouldn't. And like we had an example, well, I'll fictionalize it a little bit, of a manufacturer that wanted to work with a retailer, and the retailer wanted to use beverage data and snacking data together in the same optimization to see was there anything they could derive from insights around Red Bull and Diet Coke and in Mountain Dew that might actually be able to impact our clustering around snack products, right? Which I thought was a really cool application of that type of technology. So really we can include all types of cool components into the analysis, but you can get really, really, really deep into this space with just some pretty bare bones data.
That's great. We have a lot of questions. So in the interest of time, I'll take a few here and then we'll move on to the next slide. How do you understand the potential of items not carried?
Yeah, very good question. So because we are store specific, certainly not every store carries every item. And so we can study the mathematical relationships across all of those stores. And if one store doesn't carry item A, other stores do, we can use how it behaves in those other stores to make a prediction of how it might behave in a store that it currently doesn't exist. Same thing if we're studying a particular focused retailer that isn't carrying a particular items, we would study those, we would apply the algorithm to the rest of market, right? And study how items relate to one another, and then use those relationships as a proxy to simulate the introduction of those items currently carried in the market that need to be carried in the retailer. And then thirdly, there are some items that are just like brand new to the universe, right? Brand new innovation. Ideally, we would have in-store or in-market tests somewhere, again, because we need the AI to learn from those relationships. But if not, Most brand managers are probably running some type of discrete choice, like Nielsen bases back in the old days when I was doing that work. And those, in essence, produce a type of mathematical relationship of a new item within the portfolio of existing items. And so we can use those relationships to triangulate against items that do exist in the store, and that's where our prediction comes. So
great. No, Brian, that was a great question, and Steve, that was a great answer. One more on this slide. Why do you think many retailers are taking the top-down approach to clustering?
I think they take top-down approach to clustering because, one, it's easier to understand, right? I can explain it to my leadership. I can explain it to my manufacturer base, et cetera, on how I'm doing what I'm doing. This strategic approach my mind came up with. The second thing is it's easier, right? Like at the end of the day, merchants in particular and category advisors are balancing a ton of other priorities. And so you have to sort of balance this whole notion of, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? I can get into an extraordinary level of granularity, but there's opportunity cost in what I'm not working on in these other areas. And so is it possible for a merchant to get into an extraordinary level of detail around clustering and do it bottom up? Yeah, but I believe it's way beyond the capacity of, someone, picking around in Excel to do, or running regression on some data as an example. So I think that there's the notion of sort of time pressure and conflicting other priorities. I think there's a notion of, I really needed to be able to explain it. And I think it's really hard at the end of the day. And so it's been done for the sake of efficiency.
Yeah, Deborah, I would just add to that not only is there nothing wrong with the top-down approach, there's a lot of good with the top-down approach. The key question is there more value if there is an easier and data-based way to go lower? We believe that answer is yes. And so there's a lot of greatness that can happen out of a top-down approach. We just think that it can go further, and there is more value to be extracted by doing so.
No, that makes a ton of sense. And I think this next slide, I mean, we kind of skimmed this, but this, how e-commerce growth is making all this a bit more, challenging. And, one of the things that, I've often, you see it, you hear it, you both have worked in retail, you've experienced it, is when retailers are failing to meet shoppers' expectations. And, we've seen that, right, 84% of shoppers believe that the experience that a company provides is as important as the products or services. I mean, hey, right, you go out to dinner, the food's important, but the services, if I was to kind of compare and contrast. And then almost 75% of consumers expect retailers to understand their needs and expectations, but only about 50% believe that retailers generally understand them. And so that's a huge mismatch, in my opinion. And, one thing I think to call out here is just, Kroger's digital sales. But we've seen this across the industry. I mean, no matter whom we look at, and I think that when you're looking at up over 100%, that is really, truly unbelievable. And the retailers and the CPGs whom we've spoken to have all said that e-commerce growth has been greater than they would have expected during the pandemic, and also greater after, kind of the crisis was, as we move through that. And so, Zach, as we're seeing kind of retailers really overwhelmed with all this data, what do you think should be the approach to, I think the key word is actionable shopper insights from this data? And also, we always worry a little bit about this, kind of creep factor. How do we kind of keep that out of the story as well?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to sound very administrative and very like vanilla and boring, but data cleanliness is it is the hardest part of our job. It's not actually deriving like the insights or running the analytics. It's getting these dispersed data sets pulled together and then cleaned. And so if you're a team lead out there, or you're general manager of a manufacturer or retailer, right? I think how you organize, like what data to organize and how you guys are organizing it is a really, really critical component, because we've worked with manufacturer partners that get up to speed in, you know, a couple days. And then we have folks that it takes like months for them to pull pretty simple data together out of the same, you know, out of the same sort of databases. So I think having to think about how your organization is structuring their data, what kind of data do we need to be keeping a ledger on over time? And I'll give you an example of this, Deborah. And I'm going to steal this shamelessly from Steve for exposing my rom-com addiction, right? But if you look back, like historically, we haven't kept, as an industry, we don't do a good job of keeping historical planograms, right? Like I probably couldn't go to a major manufacturer and be like, well, what did our PSA files look like 10 years ago? But because there was nothing really you could do with it during that time period. But now you can take it and we can begin to analyze all those changes in XY coordinates on those planograms over time, and begin to triangulate now, how did those items perform as they were moved around on a planogram? So you begin to answer like okay, this is on the top shelf, this is on the bottom shelf, if I move it left or right, two facings, one facing, if I brand block it, etc. What is the value of that? And so you can begin to go unlock that sort of stuff. If we don't have that data organized, right? If we're not keeping historical ledgers of that data or things that might be useful to us and they're clean, they're very, very difficult to pull together and make useful, or it takes a lot of time. That's sort of the pig and the python, if you will.
We have a really interesting question from Michael. Do data differences arise between manufacturers and retailers' data? And if yes, how to reach a common ground?
Yeah, there's data differences. You know, the old saying goes, if you've seen one store, you've seen one store, right? Because every store is unique. That tends to be very much the case when it comes to data, particularly as that data shifts from one retailer to the next, or even within a retailer from one category to the next. There are different levels of cleanliness. There are industries that have been born and thrive based off of organizing and preparing that data. So the common ground is generally the lowest common denominator, which is where we try to be very, very specific. So there are very core things we need to know about stores. There are very core things we need to know about products. There are very core things that we need to know about availability, planograms, like all of those things. There's 5 or 6 core things that we need to know. And as long as we can kind of use that to equivalize across, regardless of the data set, that's where we are finding most success, is keep it simple, keep it core. And to Zach's earlier point, you can actually do a whole lot of data a whole lot of great things with very little data. Not all data are good, and even less are useful. And so just focus on the stuff that is both good and useful, and you can do some pretty cool things with it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. To me, this slide was very impactful, because this idea around kind of analytical thinking and, you know, this key to succeeding in you know, category management or CM today, or Catman, or however we want to refer to it. But I think we've always thought that it was a bit more art than science, but this is really showing us just how scientific it is. And if we look at kind of what's important today, and these skills are also going to be incredibly important tomorrow, where does kind of, if you will, technology, you know, the human end and technology begin, and all of that, and how, to me, this really changed my thinking quite a bit, because I do think a lot of times still, right, we're kind of shooting from the hip or the gut, as opposed to, you know, letting science help us, especially when there is so much data, as we've talked about, available. What are your thoughts?
A couple of things from me. So I do think that we need to shift as an industry. Retail has been historically slow. Category management has probably been even slower. And so we need to adopt and embrace newer approaches. That's not to say that category management will be replaced by artificial intelligence, right? in the ideal world, we see tech augmenting the human. But what we need to do as an industry is to shift out of doing and into thinking, because computers are way better at math than we are. They don't get bored. They don't mind working at night or on the weekends. So let it do what it has been created to do. And honestly, let people do what people have been created to do, which is look around the corners and think outside of the box and be creative. And so I think that the industry as a whole needs to move away from doing and more towards thinking and strategizing. And honestly, I see that's where retail and CPG will actually bring more strategic value to each other by doing that, right? Reduce the operational headache that goes into preparing insights and actions, make that much quicker, and it frees up time to actually be more creative and strategic. So that would be my reco.
Zach, how do you think about this kind of analytical thinking and kind of technology and data literacy, and how they complement when working on like large, data sets to draw shopper or category insights?
Yeah, I mean, it can definitely be overwhelming for people that it's not like a core competency. Like my background's like, I have a teaching degree, right? So you look at it, and I think tech companies need to do a better job of making this type of technology accessible for people who understand the problems, right? And then this, as Steve said, this will become less of an operations job of how many planograms can I draw, right? How accurate can I get it? And more of a, how do we get 1 + 1 + 1 to equal 5, right? So I really look at this, and I also think that as we move forward, like test and learn becomes really important, because you don't need that many stores to create critical mass of strategic or statistical significance on this stuff. And you only need about 6 weeks. I mean, that's what we tell folks if they want to go test and learn something. And then, so I think getting this capacity and the partnership and the relationship between Catman and retailer, it really complements this type of technology and what's emerging in the industry. Because if we trust each other and we can go partner to go rapidly test a lot of things, then we can execute it much, much faster in the right stores, the stores where we're going to see the ROI on.
No, that's really interesting. And I'm going to rapid fire through the next few slides. We still have a very large number of unanswered questions, so we'll do our best to speed through all of this. But I think we've definitely kind of dove into how important and effective assortment planning is, and then to this, to me, this collaboration aspect between retailers and suppliers, and making sure kind of everybody's looking at the same data, and it enhances this whole kind of rapid response, I think is absolutely mission critical. This idea around shopper centricity and kind of strengthening relationships, and this whole idea of where everybody meets in the middle. I mean, I think that right now there's this kind of big play in retail media. I mean, there's really interesting relationships that are starting to kind of play out between retail and CPG. Ultimately, the most important thing, is to improve the shopper experience, on-shelf availability, and really driving kind of higher category share. So I want to wrap up on this slide and see if we have time for just a few questions. And Steve and Zach, if we can kind of fly through these, I'm going to throw them out there. So number one, what do you think are key barriers that exist today in going to store-specific kind of optimized assortment?
For me, data and just an open mind. We have a lot of tradition we need to overcome. And it's a big shift to move from clusters into store specific. We would say you don't have to go fully store specific, particularly on day one. We can use customized clustering to curate an assortment further and further and further to that. And quite honestly, we've learned that going store specific isn't even necessary in some categories. And so just an open mind, and then know what data is good and how to use them. Those are the two things that kind of get in the way.
Okay.
I'd stick with that open mind comment around the processes that we're using at headquarters to actually digest this many planograms, right? Because we see the potential for the financial opportunity, but the blocker in all this is actually, how do I check in 5,000 planograms? How do the culture has been, I need to, as a merchant, I need to look at all 5,000 planograms and give it my seal of approval. And that's not feasible in this. So we need to be open-minded to finding new ways to proof, check in, and process these types of things as we go forward.
Okay, we have a question from Eileen. Do you see any synergy between the purchase patterns of SKUs online, with kind of enhancing how to improve retail SKU clusters?
Yeah, I love that question. From a Hivery point of view, we would love to sink our teeth into those data. Getting a lot of online data, at least to date, has not been the easiest thing to do, but we strongly have a strong hypothesis that online data can help determine assortments for local stores, and local stores can help determine assortment for the local presentation of, at least, of a digital assortment. So there is play there that my gut just tells me we got to get access to the data and then run the analyses on them. So I think there's something there, though.
And I'll ask one more question, and once again, apologize to everyone's questions that we didn't get to. Brian asked, can we run multiple categories to help retailers reallocate space within a department?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, a category is what we define it as. So a category could be frozen food, or a category could be frozen pizza, or a category could be value pizza, right? So we define categories in our own human hierarchies that we create. Data size is not a problem. It's not a problem. Like, computers have an unbelievable amount of computing capacity. This is exactly going back to the sort of, how do you begin to think differently, right? How do you think strategically about this sort of thing? So I love that question because it's spot on. You just think about what is a category a little bit differently. Yeah. And yes, you can absolutely use this type of technology to reallocate store level macro space.
Great. So I'm going to wrap it up. And obviously, I think we've just scratched the surface here with a lot of questions. And, this is a very complex topic, which I think oftentimes is just kind of, maybe because it is so complex, is not necessarily kind of given the time or attention, whether it's at the CPG side or the retail side. We do have a detailed report. We have dropped the link into the chat. Reach out to myself, Steve, or Zach if you have any questions on that. But I think just, kind of really focusing in on this slide, and, there's so much here to unpack. But I think that this kind of key message is this analytical and predictive approach to store level data analysis can help category managers extract the most out of store data. But I think it also enables this very important retailer supplier relationship collaboration, which ultimately drives, putting the shopper at the center of all of our decisions. And so, Hivery does, kind of help with all this. I think we've just scratched the surface. And, this topic today, right now, especially as we're looking at kind of the back half of 21 and changing taste, changing shopping patterns, is more important than it's ever been. And, whether it's, kind of an ML, DS approach, and kind of how to take all of that and think about clustering, I think that we're just beginning. And Zach and Steve, I apologize that we ran out of time, because this is such a critical, obviously, conversation. And there's a lot of understanding by the community, the impact this can have on their top and bottom line. How to get there, I think, is still the question. So thank you, and we've got to hop on again real soon, because this is absolutely mission critical. And I think we've got a lot of retailers with a lot of questions. So thank you so much for joining. And once again, please look at the report. Steve, Zach, thank you so much.